Chapter 5 focuses on criminal homicide. In this lecture, we will concentrate on the Model Penal Code's treatment of homicide. Criminal homicide is a class of offenses. We'll see that it's broken down into specific chargeable offenses under the Model Penal Code in just a second. But first, the general definition of criminal homicide under the Model Penal Code is: a person is guilty of criminal homicide if he purposely, knowingly, recklessly, or negligently causes the death of another human being. So essentially, criminal homicide is causing the death of another human being with some specific mental state. And we'll see that the mental states are the only things that change from one type of homicide to another. Causing the death of another human being stays the same. The three types of criminal homicide under the Model Penal Code are murder, manslaughter, and negligent homicide. You will notice that there is no such thing as first, second, third-degree murder under the Model Penal Code. There is no such thing as voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. We'll see that some states, such as Pennsylvania, have those classifications, but the Model Penal Code doesn't. The only types of criminal homicide under the Model Penal Code are murder, manslaughter, and negligent homicide. Now, for the specifics. The Model Penal Code defines murder as a homicide, so a killing of another person, causing the death of another person, that is done purposely or knowingly. So that's Part A, as you can see in this PowerPoint. So one way that you can be guilty of murder is if you purposely or knowingly cause the death of another human being. Don't worry about the exception that's mentioned in that first sentence. We'll get to that in just a couple minutes. Remember that the Model Penal Code defines purposely as it's your conscious object. So in other words, your foremost thought to cause a specific harm, in this case, to cause the death of another human being. Knowingly, if you'll remember, requires that you are practically certain that you will cause that result, in this case, the death. So, under the Model Penal Code, you're guilty of murder if it's your conscious object to cause the death of another human being, or if you're practically certain that you're going to cause the death of another human being by your actions. So, an example of a purposeful murder would be if I pulled out a gun, pointed at your head, and said, "I'm going to kill you." That would be the ultimate example of a purposeful killing. We obviously don't have to have the person saying, "I'm going to kill you," but if I fire 10 shots point blank into the core of your body, into your head, then we can surmise, if we're the jury, that I acted purposely to cause your death. It was my conscious object to cause your death. With knowingly, I am practically certain that I'm going to cause the death of another human being. So maybe my conscious object is to blow up a building. I'm practically certain I'm going to kill someone when I blow up that building, but there's always a chance that no one will be inside. My conscious object, so my purposeful mental state, would be to blow up the building. But if I caused a death in that situation, and the prosecutor can show that I was practically certain that I was also going to kill someone when I blew up that building, then I could be charged with murder. So even if I would have been happy if no one would have died, but I still acted with the thought that I was practically certain I would kill someone because I knew the building was always occupied, then I can still be charged with murder. So that's how we can see the slight difference between acting purposely or knowingly. For all intents and purposes, under the Model Penal Code, because the Model Penal Code says it's purposely or knowingly, that means we really only have to prove knowingly to prove that someone is guilty of a murder. But nonetheless, it does say committed purposely or knowingly. Part B says that you can also be guilty of murder if you act recklessly under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life. So if you'll recall, ordinary criminal recklessness under the Model Penal Code says that you are aware of a risk, it's a significant and unjustifiable risk, and you disregard that risk. So you're aware of the risk, you disregard it, and that disregard is a gross deviation from the norm. Well, in order to be charged with murder, when you act recklessly, we don't just use ordinary criminal recklessness under the Model Penal Code. It's criminal recklessness plus something else. It's criminal recklessness plus extreme indifference to the value of human life. So that means not only was it a gross deviation from the norm, that would be ordinary criminal recklessness, but it was an incredibly gross deviation from a norm, even though we could probably think of a better way of saying that. But it's not just ordinary criminal recklessness, but it's really, really, really bad criminal recklessness. Now, you'll see that paragraph is pretty long in Part B. The second part says that we can conclude that you were acting with extreme indifference to human life. You were reckless and you were manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life if you were engaged in any way in some particular felony, and you can see the ones that are listed here, such things as robbery, rape, deviant sexual intercourse by force or threat of force, arson, burglary, kidnapping, felonious escape. So if you were engaged in any of those specific offenses, so not all felonies, but just the listed ones, if you were engaged in those in any way, and a death occurred, even if you never meant for anyone to die, you are now guilty of murder. This is what is known as the felony murder rule. So if you engage in robbery, in rape, in arson, burglary, kidnapping, felonious escape, any of those listed crimes, and someone dies, maybe they die of a heart attack. You go in to rob a bank, and the teller has a heart attack and dies. Even though you never meant to kill anyone, you didn't even have perhaps a gun, you were using your finger in your pocket to make it look like a gun. Because that death occurred during one of the listed felonies, you're on the hook for murder. And so, there's been a lot of criticism over this rule, saying that we should have at least some mental element attached to it beyond the mental requirements for the underlying offense, like robbery, rape, or whatever it may be, that we should have some kind of element that says you must have at least intended to have committed the murder, or you had to at least to have anticipated that a murder would have occurred. But the law has already done that. It says that if you decide to engage in one of these crimes, you should know that a death is very likely to occur. It's a substantial and unjustifiable risk, and you're showing extreme indifference to the value of human life. So the prosecutor only in these cases only has to prove that you committed the robbery or the rape or the arson or whatever it may be, and that a death occurred. They don't have to prove any mental element beyond that for the death. So if you burn down your house for the insurance money, and the firefighters wreck their fire truck on the way to responding to the fire, and at least one of the firefighters dies, you're on the hook for felony murder. So it's a really wide net that catches a lot of people, and again, there's a lot of criticism of this rule, but nonetheless, the Model Penal Code includes it as one of the types of murder. So again, for murder, you either commit it purposely or knowingly, or you commit it recklessly under extreme indifferences, under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to human life. The Model Penal Code's manslaughter definition is two parts, and so there are two ways that you can commit manslaughter under the Model Penal Code. The most common way is if you commit a homicide, so if you cause the death of another human being recklessly. So this is ordinary recklessness. It's not recklessness with extreme indifference to human life. So if you were aware of the risks, you ignored those risks, and someone died, then you're on the hook for manslaughter. So if you're driving your car and the speed limit is 35, but you're driving 70, you're aware that the speed limit is 35, you're aware that there's a substantial and unjustifiable risk that you might hit somebody, and you keep on driving, If we determine that that is reckless behavior, that that's a gross deviation from the norm, and you do kill someone, then you're responsible for manslaughter. The second part of the manslaughter statute under the Model Penal Code is the exception that was mentioned under murder. So Part B under manslaughter deals with the heat of passion, as we commonly call it, the heat of passion killings. So these are where the killer did act purposely or knowingly to cause the death of another human being, but there was some extreme mental or emotional disturbance which provided an explanation or excuse. So the classic example is you come home unexpectedly, you find your spouse in bed with someone else, you become so angry, so distraught that you basically lose your mind. So you're not criminally insane, but in that moment you have essentially lost your senses. So you, in the wording of the Model Penal Code, you're acting under the influence of an extreme mental or emotional disturbance. And if you kill your spouse and his or her lover, then you could possibly claim that this was manslaughter and not murder. So normally it would be murder. If you just came into a house and shot two people in bed, that would be murder. But we're saying that you should have a partial defense. So remember when we talked about defenses, we said they were partial and complete. This is a partial defense. The prosecutor is going to try to prove that it's murder, but you, the defendant, are going to try to argue that there was an extreme mental or emotional disturbance and that your crime should be downgraded from murder to manslaughter. So under manslaughter, the two types of manslaughters under the Model Penal Code are ones that are committed recklessly or ones that would otherwise be murder, but there's an extreme mental or emotional disturbance that excuses them partially and brings the charge down to manslaughter. The last type of homicide under the Model Penal Code is negligent homicide, and it's pretty easily understood. It's a homicide that's committed negligently. So if you were not aware, if you recall what the definition of negligence is under the Model Penal Code, it requires that you are not aware of a risk, you should have been aware of the risk. Failure to be aware was a gross deviation from the norm. So in this case, if you caused the death acting in that mental state, if you should have been aware that the speed limit had changed, but you weren't aware, but that was a gross deviation to not be aware, so let's say it's a school zone, the speed limit had dropped down to 15 miles an hour, but you still proceeded along at 50 miles an hour. Any reasonable person would have seen that the school zone lights were flashing. You didn't notice them for some reason. So it wasn't a conscious disregard of the speed limit. That would be recklessness if you consciously disregarded. But this was a disregard that you were of a risk that you were not aware of. But you should have been aware that it was slower. So we can charge you with criminal homicide in the form of negligent homicide if you kill someone while acting negligently.